So I begin the reading from the Letters of Yoga by Sri Aurobindo, Chapter 7, entitled Surrender, with the subchapter The Meaning of Surrender. The Divine gives itself to those who give themselves without reserve and in all their parts to the Divine. For them the calm, the light, the power, the bliss, the freedom, and the whiteness, the heights of knowledge, the seas of Ananda. Surrender is giving oneself to the Divine. To give everything one is or has to the Divine and regarding nothing as one's own, to obey only the Divine will and no other, to live for the Divine and not for the ego. Self-surrender is to give up yourself and all that is yours, mind and everything else to the Divine, so that the Divine force may take everything and change it. Surrender means to consecrate everything in oneself to the Divine, to offer all one is and has, not to insist on one's ideas, desires, habits, etc., but to allow the Divine truth to replace them by its knowledge, will, and action everywhere. Surrender means to be entirely in the Mother's hand and not to resist in any way by egoism or otherwise her light, knowledge, will, the working of her force, etc. The essence of surrender is not to ask the Mother before doing anything, but to accept wholeheartedly the influence, guidance, and the guidance when the joy and peace come down, to accept them without question or cavil and let them grow, when the force is felt at work to let it work without opposition, when the knowledge is given to receive and follow it, when the will is revealed to make oneself its instrument. To believe that one is being constantly guided by the Divine in the heart is not necessarily surrender. It is necessary to be detached, to see what are the divine forces and undivine, and to reject the undivine forces. It is only by this discrimination that one can make a true surrender to the Divine in the heart. True surrender, begins when there is true self-offering. Next subchapter is a free surrender. The Divine can lead. He does not drive. There is an internal freedom permitted to everyone, every mental being called man, to assent or not to assent to the Divine leading. How else can any real spiritual evolution be done? All the play in this world is based on a certain relative free will in the individual being. Even in the sadhana it remains, and his consent is necessary at each step. Even though it is by surrender to the Divine that he escapes from ignorance and separateness and ego, it must be at every step a free surrender. Each person has his own freedom of choice up to a certain point, unless he makes a full surrender, and as he uses the freedom, has to take the spiritual or other consequences. The help can only be offered, not imposed. Silence, absence of frank confession, means a desire in the vital to go its own way. When there is no longer concealment, when there is a physical self-opening to the divine, then the divine can intervene. Next subchapter is the will to surrender. All can be done by the divine, the heart and nature purified, the inner consciousness awakened, the veils removed, if one gives oneself to the divine with trust and confidence. And even if one cannot do so fully at once, yet the more one does so, the more the inner help and guidance comes, and the contact and the experience of the divine grows within. If the questioning mind becomes less active and humility and the will to surrender grow in you, this ought to be perfectly possible. But no other strength and tapasya are there needed, but this alone. Surrender cannot be made at once. It is not so easy, for there is much in the being that resists. But one must have the will to surrender. It is the same with the becoming an instrument. If one has the will and calls on the Mother and opens oneself as much as possible to her, then gradually these things develop in the nature. In the difficulties that arise are in the nature itself. If the difficulties that arise are in the nature itself, it is inevitable that they should arise and manifest themselves. Surrender is not easy. It is resisted by a large part of the nature. If the mind forms the will to surrender, all these inner obstacles are bound to show themselves. The sadhak has then to observe them and detach himself from them, reject them from his nature and overcome. This may take a very long time, but it has to be done. Outer obstacles cannot prevent the inner surrender unless they are supported by the resistance in the nature itself. The next subchapter would be the inner surrender, but for now I stop here and will continue to read in the next hangout.